Good afternoon, Grand Junction, TEDx. I'm delighted to be here. My name's Buescher, and I want to talk to you about, and I expect you all to groan when I say this, I want to talk about politics. Now, I spent a number of years in the political world, but I'm going back to a lesson that was given to me back when I was in the commercial world. And I went to a seminar and the person said, the most important thing you need to know is that every system is perfectly designed to create the results that it consistently creates. Now I want to say that again. Every system is perfectly designed to create the results that it consistently creates. And I think that applies to our political system. I mean, all of us are upset, right? Democrats won't work with Republicans. Republicans won't work with Democrats. They call each other names. Compromise, cooperation have become bad words. And so what's the cause of this? What's the system breakdown that has led us to where we are? I've spent the last 4 years working on issues related to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering. It's a funny word. It came about in 1812, over 200 years ago. Eldridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts, and he wanted to protect some of his friends in the state senate. So he worked with them, and they drew this map. And folks looked at that map and said, that's crazy. It looks like a salamander. And out of that came the word gerrymander that we've had ever since. Now, I want to give you just a little bit of how gerrymandering works. Imagine a district with 50 voters. 60% of them are blue and 40% of them are red. If the voting areas are drawn fairly, for 5, we would have something like this. 2 blue winners and 3 red winners. And it represents what the district is. But if it's drawn a different way, we can end up with 5 blue winners and no red winners. That's not right. It can even be drawn the other way, so that the minority party gets more winners than the majority party. There's another problem with gerrymandering that I think is actually more important and more destructive to our system. And this is what the parties do. They want to create the maximum number of safe seats. If you look at Colorado in the next to last congressional election, in our 7 congressional elections, the average margin of victory was 23%. 23%. You can't argue that those are competitive seats. It's fairly clear that 6 out of the 7 in Colorado are what would be called safe seats. The same situation exists in our state house, where 65 state representatives are up for election. Only 3 or 4 of those are really competitive. In our state senate, it's a little better. 35 senators, and maybe 6 of them are competitive. But what does that mean? It means that those folks that are elected only have to cater to their base. They don't have to listen to everyone in their district. They have no incentive to compromise. They have no incentive to be cooperative. So, we looked at this and said, that's not right. That's not the way we want to govern ourselves. Too often, the process is controlled by political appointees. In Colorado, before Y and Z that I'm going to talk about, our congressional seats were drawn by the state legislature, and a commission drew the seats for the state legislature. Unfortunately, that commission was too easily controlled by political appointees. way too much political influence. Secondly, I talked about competitive. Way too many of our seats are not competitive. Thirdly, the resort to deadlock was to go to the courts. And the courts are particularly ill-equipped to deal with this issue. We've seen litigation for the last several years on gerrymandering and bad districts, and it just isn't working. The courts are not a good place to solve this problem. In Colorado, for the last 30 years, whichever party has been in the majority has been able to draw seats to protect that minority. Now, I think you all know that every 10 years we go through this process. In the year after the census, we go through the process of drawing new congressional seats and new seats in the state legislature. So it's coming on us fairly quickly. We started working on a reform about 4 years ago, and we came up with a number of principles. And these are the principles that we talked about. First of all, we wanted to create a balanced commission. A balanced commission that is composed equally of Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated. Nobody anywhere in the country has done that. So we created a commission, or we created the idea of a commission with 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 unaffiliated. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that the maps were drawn in a way by nonpartisan staff that works at the Capitol for both parties rather than by the parties. It's hard to explain how good the parties have gotten at this. But, you know, we now have information on how precincts vote. And frequently, there are districts that cross those precincts, so the parties can figure out even smaller areas than precincts. With a high degree of probability, they know how those areas are going to vote. So they can draw maps that absolutely guarantee the turnout and the results that they want. We didn't want that. We want these maps to be drawn by nonpartisan staff that doesn't have a political game to play or to win. We wanted to make sure that this process was subject to open meetings rules and open records. Because in past efforts, we've seen how at the very last minute, a proposal comes forth, is adopted the next day, and nobody had a chance to study it or see it before it was considered. We didn't want that to happen. We wanted to have clear criteria for the map drawing. Criteria that didn't favor either party. Criteria that said we would protect communities of interest. Criteria that said we don't want you to break up cities unless you have to. And if you break up a city or a county one time, it doesn't mean that you should do it a second time. So we worked a lot on clear criteria that didn't favor either party. And then we got to the hard part. We said we wanted to create the maximum number of competitive districts. Now, look, we all know that Boulder's not going to elect very many Republicans, right? We also know that rural Colorado is not going to elect too many Democrats. So we couldn't say that every seat should be made competitive, but we could say and direct the commission to create the maximum number of competitive seats. So those are the principles that we came up with. And what did we do? We met, 4 of us, on October 30th, 2015 for lunch. And we talked about the things that we had failed to do when we'd been in the legislature. I'd been in the legislature, all the other 3 had too. 2 of them went on to be speakers of the House, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. I went on to be Secretary of State. And we decided we'd try to run a redistricting reform. We put it together. We submitted it to the process. We were challenged by the progressive groups, which was really hard for me because I'm a Democrat, and it was my Democrat friends that were challenging what we were doing because the Democrats had come out ahead in state legislature. But we persevered. They challenged us, took us to the Supreme Court, and they beat us. We'd made a mistake. We set up a system with one commission to do both state and federal. And the Supreme Court said that violates Colorado's rather arcane rule against having more than one subject in an initiative. So we regrouped. We started over. And some interesting things happened. The League of Women Voters signed on with us. They liked what we were doing. They were very, very helpful. They brought national groups into the discussion and helped us make a better proposal. And a gentleman by the name of Kent Thiry, who is the CEO of DaVita, a Fortune 100 company, signed on. He said, I like what you're doing. And we put together a new proposal. But now we had national groups supporting us, and we had the money to get on the ballot. So people had to take us more seriously. We filed our measure. And 2 weeks later, those same progressive groups filed another measure competing with us. And I took an afternoon and I read their measures and studied it. And lo and behold, you know what? There was a lot of good stuff in it. So I called them and I said, folks, you know what? I like a lot of stuff that you put in your measure. Let's work together. Let's see if we can do this together. It took them a week to get back, but they said, we'll give it a try. We don't trust those Republicans you're working with, but we'll give it a try. We got together, we met in Kent Thiry's office, and I made the same comment. I said, you know, I looked at what you put together, and there's a lot of stuff in here I like. There's a few things I think we did better, but I'll tell you, there's a number of things you did better than we did. And their attorney, a wonderful attorney by the name of Mark Gruskin, looked at me and said, Bernie, you should like it. We stole 85% of it from you. And we all laughed. And the ice was broken. And you know what happened after that? We quit arguing about whose was better. We started working on how to make it work. We went through 85 drafts. Mark Gruskin and Bill Hobbs, two marvelous attorneys, worked together to draft these measures. And then we had to make another decision after we all agreed on it. Should we ask the legislature to refer this, or should we petition on? It costs about $2 million to petition on in Colorado. But after a lot of discussion, we decided to ask the legislature. And you know what? The legislature adopted it and passed it 100-0. Not a single person could vote against it. So we were on the ballot. And then the voters, November of 2018, passed it with over 70% of the votes. It is now the law in Colorado. But our work isn't done. We need to get good citizens to apply to be on these commissions. That process will start in about 6 months. And I'd urge every one of you to consider whether you've got the time to devote to help make Colorado work. Now let me tell you, we learned some things. I learned some things from this process. If you want to get things done, you've got to do them outside the legislative process. You've got to get citizens together to work on these things. And you can't get just Democrats and Republicans. You've got to get those unaffiliated voters engaged in the process. In Colorado, 39% of our voters are unaffiliated. I know there's one person in the audience who ran as an unaffiliated and knows how hard that is. That shouldn't be the case. We've got to take back our governance, and part of it is getting the unaffiliated involved. Then when you start work on the process, you've got to get everyone around the table, those national groups as well as the local groups. And you've got to keep everyone at the table all through the process. We did that. We wouldn't let anybody leave. And if they really disagreed, then we worked hard on listening. That's the next thing. We have to all listen to each other in order to make these things work and to create the products that our citizens deserve. I'll close with one thought. I've been reading a lot of history, and I've been reading about 1783 when they came together in Philadelphia to write our Constitution. And these folks came up with the idea of creating a more perfect union. They knew they weren't creating a perfect union, but they were creating a more perfect union. And they wanted us to continue that work. And there's a famous story. When they finished their work, Benjamin Franklin walked out of the hall, and a lady that we only know as Mrs. Smith came up to him and said, "Dr. Franklin, do we have a monarchy or do we have a republic?" And he responded, "Ma'am, you've got a republic if you can keep it. It's our job, it's all of our job to keep this republic." Thank you.